Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. We're your hosts, Cassie and Kendall.
On today's episode, we're talking about the neuroscience of depression. Our guest is Dr. Alex Korb, a neuroscientist, writer, and coach. He has studied the brain and mental health for more than 15 years, starting with an undergraduate degree in neuroscience from Brown University before earning a PhD in neuroscience from UCLA. He is author of the Upward Spiral and the Upward Spiral Workbook and is currently adjunct assistant professor at UCLA in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences. Outside of the lab, he's available for personal coaching, consulting services, and speaking engagements. He is head coach of the UCLA Women's Ultimate Frisbee team and has a wealth of experience in yoga, mindfulness, physical fitness, and even stand-up comedy. Hi, Alex. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
To start our conversation, we wanted to talk about or define what is depression, and could you walk us through a few of the symptoms?
Yeah, depression is a diagnosis, and there's a bunch of symptoms that if you meet those criteria, then you can be classified as having depression. And it's a lot more than what we colloquially think of as the term depression. We think of, we use it interchangeably with being sad all the time. And low mood is one of the symptoms of depression, but oftentimes people who are depressed aren't even necessarily sad all the time. They can feel this emptiness where their emotions should be. But there's a lot more than mood going on. There's often difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, or conversely, sometimes people sleep too much. You can have little interest in doing things, like things you used to enjoy, you just don't enjoy anymore. People can feel have a sense of guilt or worthlessness, difficulty concentrating or focusing on important things. Oftentimes there's issues with appetite, like you just lose your appetite, or sometimes people just they eat too much. And then there's also issues with energy, like you just feel so tired all the time. And one of the most concerning parts of it for some people is these thoughts or feelings that life just isn't worth living, and that can progress even more. And so if you just the way that depression is diagnosed is if you have 5 or more of these symptoms for at least 2 weeks, and you qualify as having major depressive disorder. But two people can be depressed and look totally different from each other.
Well, and you mentioned the difference between, feeling depressed versus having depression. Can you talk a little bit about what someone might do to recognize those symptoms in themselves and when they should start to seek treatment for it?
Yeah. I think even though the upward spiral is essentially about depression, I think sometimes people make too much of this bright line distinction between being depressed and not being depressed, or having clinically being depressed or not, as if there's this line that you can draw that says, oh, I'm super depressed, I need to go to a psychiatrist and start doing stuff, or, oh, I'm not depressed, I'm totally fine, everything is hunky-dory. And so I think that's actually very unhelpful. The diagnosis of depression is really helpful for insurance companies doing billing. It's really helpful for researchers trying to nail down what they're doing. And it's sometimes helpful for doctors to be able to clarify well, is it, more of this or more of that, and know what the treatment is. But for someone suffering from it, it's just a matter of oh, are you, experiencing any of these symptoms? You don't need to try and diagnose yourself. And the question of well, when do you need to go seek professional help is kind of a matter of like, well, have you taken steps to deal with it on your own? Have you tried to take steps and failed and you keep failing? Just like, if something is wrong with your car, well, how do you know when to take it to a mechanic, or can you do it yourself? Well, have you tried filling it up with gas? Right? Like, oh, okay, now it works again. Like, okay, sometimes you can try doing things. Or if your computer isn't working, when do I need an expert? Well, have you tried restarting it? Like, okay, like there's some things you can do on your own. And in fact, that is basically the reason I wanted to write the Upward Spiral, or one of the primary reasons, to help people realize like, oh, there's so many things that you can do on your own, that while you're sitting there wondering, like, do I have depression or not? Like, you don't need to sit there waiting for it to get worse to go seek help. You can start making these changes and seeing, oh, I'm much better now. Or realizing, oh, I can't do it all on my own. I need some guidance to implement this stuff. Or, just you made the appointment and it's still a month away. Like, she just sit around going into a downward spiral. Or like, even you start taking medication. Well, there's still stuff you can do on your own. I wanted to demystify it, because a lot of times people think the only course of action is just going to a psychiatrist, and the only thing that they can do is prescribe medication. And that's just like, oh, that's a really helpful thing, but it's not like you are totally helpless.
I really like the analogy of like troubleshooting your computer because, you're like going to the usual things that you try to do to fix the computer, like with yourself. And then when those things are no longer working, it's like, okay, time to call in the expert. Um, so that one resonates with me a lot. Someone who has common issues with their computer. But you did briefly mention the downward spiral, and I know that the upward spiral is about it's a more solutions based reversal from trying to combat depression. So I wondered if you could talk about what the downward spiral is like and kind of how that gets started and continues to go down.
Yeah. A downward spiral is something I think everyone's kind of familiar with. It's just, there's little ones and bigger ones. And it's just the idea that sometimes things happen to you that have unforeseen consequences. You make a decision that has inadvertent impacts. Like, you have a thought that pops into your head. Someone invites you to a party and you have a thought that pops into your head, like, I don't really think I have that much fun, or I don't have that much energy. So then, like, you don't go. And then you see all your friends posting pictures from the party, and you're like, oh, you feel left out and unincluded. And like, you just stay up too late watching Netflix instead. And then you sleep in too late. And the next day you feel kind of a little isolated and off. And, and then you're like, oh, I don't feel like exercising. So you don't exercise. And like, these things can compound. And that's sort of like a silly little example, but, a few days or a few weeks of that, you can let it go. Your energy levels can keep going down, and you feel more isolated. You start having more negative thoughts that makes you make worse decisions. You start drinking more, and so on. And that's sort of like the edge. That's kind of what most people experience. And that's kind of like what the edge of being depressed is. And it's just that in some people, their brains are more emotionally reactive, or as their mood starts to change, it has a greater impact on their enjoyment or their sense of self-worth or their actions. And so it's easier for them to get stuck in that downward spiral, and therefore just sort of keeps going down. And one of the problems is that once you start to go down, it's self-reinforcing, because the your emotions become more negative, which changes your thoughts and changes your actions and changes the decisions that you make, which further reinforces that. And if it goes too far for too long, then yeah, at some point a doctor could come along and draw a line and be like, oh, yep, you've crossed the threshold into depression. But I think it's much more helpful to just notice your own tendencies, so that you can see before you start to go into a downward spiral, to look back on your life and be like, oh, that's interesting. Like every time, I end a relationship, like I go through this whole thing, or like every time, I lose a job or something, and to be able to understand your own tendencies to stop the downward spiral before it starts, or catch it a little bit earlier, or even if you are totally stuck, to understand, oh, what are the things that I can start to do on my own to reverse that? Or even at the barest minimum, to simply be able to understand why I'm stuck in the first place. Because oftentimes people are left, they're questioning, what's wrong with me? I'm so lazy or whatever, and just realize like, oh, no, this is how the brain works. This is the dynamics, and this is some of the unfortunate consequences.
It sounds like it requires a lot of self-awareness to be an active participant in reversing the back to the upward spiral.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the lack of self-awareness that means we often repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And because you have parts of your brain, like the habit circuitry and the emotional circuitry, they don't really care about, your conscious awareness of things. Like the conscious aware part that makes decisions and intentional actions, that's a very small piece of the puzzle. Your brain is sort of content to go on autopilot, even without you aware. It's just that you have to suffer the consequences. And one of the reasons I wanted to write The Upward Spiral is to help people gain that awareness, to realize like, oh, I didn't realize like these choices that I was making to just skip the party or stay up late or not exercise, or how much losing a job and all these things, how much they would impact me and actually change my brain and make the problem worse. And that first step of gaining understanding is often the most powerful, because then you're like, oh, well, I can actually start to do some of these other things to reverse what's happening and change the course of depression.
So, as we're talking about kind of deepening an understanding of how our brains work as it's related to depression, I was curious of your opinion. Why is it important for us to kind of have that awareness or idea of how our brains operate when dealing with something like depression?
Yeah. It's funny. That was some version of that question was like when I first started writing The Upward Spiral, and the editor at New Harbinger, like after I submitted my first set of chapters, she was like, why are you spending so much time like explaining like all this neuroscience? Like, just tell people what they can do. Like people want to know just like, what can I do? And it took me a while to like figure out like an answer. I was like, oh, like, because to me, I'm a neuroscientist. I find it inherently fascinating, and I just think people think it's interesting. But I realized that it is actually an essential piece of the puzzle, because there's a million books out there that will tell you what to do. You could just listen to a podcast like, oh, do this, like, just a bunch of list of life hacks, and oh, I just need to exercise and sleep better and do all this. And the problem is, for one, if you just kind of like try and follow this recipe without lack of understanding, well, your circumstances might be different, your brain might be different, and you'll just sort of like, stumbling along, just trying to follow this recipe and think like, oh, there's something wrong with me because I can't just follow this recipe. As just as if you're trying to follow a cooking recipe, but your oven works, is a little bit hotter, or you don't have, sugar, you only have brown, white sugar, you only have brown sugar. Like you can't just always follow someone else's recipe and think it's going to work perfectly, because your brain is different, your life is different. The other key piece is I realized that there are many other people out there like me who want to understand these things, that, whether you are diagnosed with depression or not, sometimes we get in our own way. If you're a, smart, passionate person who feels like there's this battle sometimes between the thinking, analytical parts of you and the emotional parts of you, and oftentimes we don't allow ourselves to take action until we understand why, right? So the irony is that, because this when the editor asked me this question, I was like struggling, because I realized, well, you don't need to know the neuroscience. Like, you could just do all of this stuff. But most smart, successful people aren't just used to like just follow some list, blindly do it. And like, the irony is that, oh, you actually might be better off if you weren't trying to think through things so much. You just took things on faith and just whatever. But that is, you are stuck. And so understanding the neuroscience helps you get out of your own way, because it helps you stop blaming yourself, and it helps you realize that these suggestions aren't just like random things that some, new age guru cooked up. Like, they're backed by science, and they have measurable effects on your brain activity and chemistry. In the same way that if you went to see a psychiatrist and they were like, hey, try this pill, and you're like, oh, what's happening? What is it doing? Is it going to have any side effects? And they're like, oh, don't worry about it. Just trust me. Like, it's going to help you feel better. And you're like, but what's happening in my brain? Why am I stuck here? Like, well, psychiatrists have explained the story of like, well, this is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and it's targeting this system, and it's going to change the serotonin system. There are some problems with that story, by the way, which have been published recently, but it helps people to understand some of the science, to be like, oh, I'm changing my brain. And my only problem is that we only sort of use those scientific explanations when we're talking about medication. And I was like, well, if people understood all these other simple life changes they could make, and how they often target the brain in more powerful, even more nuanced ways than like medication or other high-tech interventions, then you would get out of your own way and just start doing them, and you would have more enthusiasm and motivation to take action.
I love that enthusiasm to take more action, because I think that goes a long way in depression and reversing the spiral. Uh, a lot of people often ask the question, how did my brain get this way? Can you talk about some of the factors that determine whether a person might suffer from depression in their life?
Yeah, there's three primary factors that I like to sort of narrow it down to. Well, they're kind of broad. The first is genetics, like the genes that you get from your parents. Those provide the initial direction in which your brain is likely to develop. There's not a blueprint for how you're going to turn out, but it's a tendency. You're probably going to go in this way. And then the early experiences that you have as a child further refine and shape the development of those brain circuits. So stress or trauma, or certainly your relationship with your parents and how you attach, it changes the development of those circuits and turns up or turns down or on or off certain genes. And then there's your current life circumstances, the job you have or don't have, the nature of your relationships, the coping habits that you have, and those further shape and refine how reactive certain circuits in your brain are. And the combination of those things leads people to have brains that are, more emotionally reactive or less emotionally reactive, and habits that are good at helping them compensate for whatever kind of brain that they have. And so one of the things I think it's important for people to understand is there are forces outside of your control that have contributed to shaping your brain. And that's important because I object to a lot of like life coaches and gurus who are just like, oh, you just need to manifest everything. You have total control. It's like, no, you don't have total control of your brain. And sometimes that makes people think like, oh, well, I don't have total control, that I have no control. Like, no, the truth is that you have the brain that you have, just like you have the body that you have. I use the example a lot of times of it might be really important for me to be a great basketball player, but there's forces outside of my control about how tall I am and how fast I can run and how high I can jump. And yet, given my biology, I can still practice passing and I can practice whatever and understanding the game. And that is really important to understand, that you have these things that shape your brain that create the tendency to fall into the pattern of depression. And some of those things you can't control, but some of them are things that are in your current life also, which you can't control, like whether you lost your job or not. And getting clear about what pieces I can't control helps free you up to realize, oh, well, then I'm going to focus my efforts on the things that I can control, including the habits that I'm trying to form or how I reframe things.
It is a relief to hear that you can't control everything in regards to your brain, because I think there could be a whole other episode talking about advice that could fall flat for people with depression, kind of that catch-all advice from life coaches and things like that, because they're on a different battle than other people in a lot of regards. But it is refreshing to hear that, because your brain is going to do certain things, and you can only control what you can control in that sphere. So that is always comforting to hear. As we're talking about the brain's chemistry and how emotions play a role, especially with depression, I wanted to talk about something you mentioned in your book, which is the emotional brain bias, and why that might be exaggerated or more so for someone with depression or at risk of depression.
Yeah. Well, we all have these different circuits in our brain. I should say, like, we all have the same circuits in our brain. We have all these different circuits. There's emotional circuitry and more analytical circuitry and habit circuitry. And it turns out that if you have a brain that is more emotionally reactive, then you're more likely to get stuck at some point in this pattern of depression, just because, yeah, you're really excited about things and that's awesome, but then you feel disappointment and heartbreak and so deeply. And sometimes that like downswing in negative emotions, then it darkens your thoughts and it makes you make worse decisions. And so it's easier to get stuck in that downward spiral. And sometimes we can look at someone who has a little bit more equanimity and be like, oh, why can't I just be like them? And it's like, well, you'd miss out on some of the exciting parts about your life. You wouldn't be you. And so the key is to be the best version of yourself, to understand, okay, given the brain that I have, what are the best habits to develop? What's the best way to go about my life? And so I can reduce the volume a little bit on my emotional reactivity, but I can't fundamentally change how emotionally reactive my brain is, but nor would you want to. You want to just um, enjoy the benefits of your brain for what it has, and for when it gets in the way, figure out alternate ways of dealing with that that don't lead to further problems in the long term, right? Like alcohol. Alcohol is a great short-term solution. Alcohol is a problem not because it doesn't work, but because it works to like, oh, calm you down. It's just that if that becomes your go-to way of dealing with emotions, oh, then it starts to create more problems than it solves. And that's when you're really stuck.
So you've mentioned habits a few times, and those are really important. So how can someone who's struggling start to create those more positive, more pleasurable habits?
Yeah. I think one thing I really liked from the research is about this idea of self-affirmation, which and focusing on your strengths and what you're good at. Because a lot of times when you're really struggling, uh, it's very easy to focus on your bad habits and see, oh, I have that bad habit. It's bad for me. I need to change it. And if I don't change it, I'm going to have all these negative consequences. But habits are hard to change. And the more that you focus on the things that you don't like about yourself and how hard they are to change, it makes you have more negative thoughts. It can stress you out more, which unfortunately, based on how the brain works, the stronger emotions you have, the more it pushes you back towards your habits. And so sometimes the easiest way to start to change your habits is to stop focusing so much on your bad habits and how bad they are, and instead focus on your good habits, the things you're already good at, the things that you like about yourself, the things that you wouldn't want to change. And this has elements of gratitude and just focusing on things that you can control, and just focus on emphasizing those qualities, and uh, then it can improve your mood. And then from an improved mental state, it's easier to make some adjustments in these quote unquote bad habits, because instead of feeling like, oh, that's all I am is a big bundle of bad habits, it's more like, oh, yeah, I have these bad habits. But I have all these other good habits. So it's more like changing your shirt, right? Like if you looked at yourself and you're like, I hate the way I look. If you frame it as like, oh, but I love my face and I love my haircut and I love my whatever, you're like, oh, it's just the shirt that I don't like. Oh, that's easy to change, as opposed to focusing so much on the negative consequences and how hard it is to change.
And as we're talking or kind of transitioning towards a solutions type conversation, like reversing that downward spiral, I think one thing that's worth noting is obviously depression is unique for everybody. But one of the hard things about reversing that spiral is like having the motivation or the energy to take the step towards like positive actions to help. Like for instance, in your book, you talk about the benefits of going to the gym or exercising to release those endorphins to kind of get the ball rolling. But for someone with depression, it can just be so hard to even get to the gym. So what would your advice be about like taking the first step to reverse that downward spiral and start the upward spiral?
Yeah. I think one of the key things is starting small. Uh, and this is actually one of the reasons why understanding can be so helpful, because a lot of times we can look at some potentially positive action that we'll take and say, like, like going to the gym, or, getting a job or hanging out with your friends or something. And we can be like, oh, well, that's not going to solve all of my problems. So what's the point in doing anything? Like, and that thought that pops into your head of like, well, that's not going to solve all of my problems. That's a true thought. Like, correct. It's not going to solve everything. But then we have this habit of like, oh, using that thought as a reason to then not take that helpful action. And and this is why I called the book The Upward Spiral, of this idea that, well, if you just take one small positive action, or just recognize how this thought that might be true is still getting in your way of taking some small positive action, and taking that small positive action anyway. And as you take some small positive action, yes, it's not going to solve everything, but it will start to change your brain. It can improve your mood or change what you are focusing on. And then those brain changes make it easier to take further positive life changes. And so a lot of times, like exercise is a great example. A lot of times people with depression think, well, I need to go to the gym and exercise for 45 minutes because that's what the public health recommendation is. But I don't have the energy to go to the gym, and I hate getting on a treadmill. Excuse me. And I hate getting on a treadmill. And even if I did that, I couldn't do that 3 times a week. And even if I could do it 3 times this week, I know I would stop doing it. So what's the point? And so we use the fact that we aren't doing a perfect action, or that it might be difficult in the future, as a reason to not do it in the first place. Instead, I like to focus on very small changes. Well, just walk around the block. And you could say, well, that's not going to solve everything. And sometimes doctors and physicians inadvertently feed into that message, because they're like, well, you have to exercise this amount for it to be effective in treating the depression. But just because the goal is to eventually get to, exercising for 45 minutes 3 times a week or whatever, does not mean that that's where you need to start. And even though going for a walk around the block is not going to solve your depression, it's 1,000 times better than just sitting on the couch doing nothing. So oftentimes, like with exercise, we have these big grand plans of these big, huge changes that we can make that just seem totally inaccessible, and so we don't do them. And the small changes that you can actually do are infinitely more beneficial to you than some big grand plan that you don't do and criticize yourself for not doing. So instead of trying to figure out the best action, just do the simplest, smallest thing that is better than the default of what your depressed brain is trying to get you to do. So it's trying to get you to lie on the couch all day. And you're like, okay, well, I'm just going to walk outside. And that can start to create more positive habits. And then maybe next week, you're like, oh, I'll walk around the block twice. And just these small changes, because even a very small change impacts you in so many ways. It's something you can control. It gets your body moving. It might expose you to sunlight, which is going to change your circadian rhythms and sleep patterns. And it keeps you from getting stuck in the downward spiral, because if you're just sitting on the couch, you would, just be ruminating and getting worse. So at least stopping doing bad things is a good thing.
Earning your continuing education hours doesn't have to be a painful experience. The right course can open your mind to new possibilities, increase your confidence, and hand you powerful tools to transform your clients' lives. Praxis Continuing Education and Training teams up with some of the brightest minds in mental health to provide cutting-edge, evidence-based training for practitioners. You can learn firsthand from experts like Stephen C. Hayes, Kelly Wilson, Robin Walzer, Kirk Strassel, and many others. Find your next training at praxiscet.com. That's praxiscet.com.
I have to ask a follow up on that exercise thing. So, like during the pandemic, a lot of people on TikTok call them hot girl walks, and they go for a walk every day just to get out of their house. And my husband and I make sure we do that because we're both working from home. But every conversation we've had, exercise is a very crucial part to mental health. Can you tell us a little bit about what your brain is doing during exercise that makes it so impactful?
There's so many different impacts of exercise that it's really hard to summarize. One of the big ones is reducing the stress hormone cortisol, which just shows that exercise helps your brain better deal with stress so that you're not being pulled into bad habits so strongly. It can improve your sleep quality. It changes the electrical activity of the brain during sleep to make it more restful. So you don't necessarily need more sleep. It makes your sleep more restorative. It affects the serotonin system and the norepinephrine system and the dopamine system. It helps strengthen the brain with this chemical called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's very easy to get lost in all the weeds, but that just like helps strengthen neurons and make them more resilient to stress. And it can even help neurons grow or even grow new neurons. It can help rewire the brain so that you form new connections and start to form new habits. And so there's like this wide, diffuse effects and powerful effects that exercise has on the brain. And to start getting those effects, there's really two key steps you need to do, because everyone's always so focused on the like exercise, like formal exercise of like going to the gym and going for 45 minutes. But this, hot girl walk or whatever, like that's great because it's just so simple and it doesn't need to solve all of your problems. Like, yeah, just get out and start moving. And so the key first step, I think, is often not thinking about getting exercise, quote exercise, just avoiding total inactivity. Like if you're sitting in front of a computer all day, we'll just make sure to get up every half hour, and just walk for like 30 seconds or do, a jumping jack or just go for a walk at lunch. Like avoiding sitting totally stationary all day is one of the biggest, most powerful steps that gets you halfway there. Because when you are sort of staying a little bit active, then it becomes much easier to occasionally increase the intensity of that activity. But both are kind of crucial, because even if you do intense activity sometimes, but you're like totally stationary the other time, you're also going to have problems. So avoiding inactivity is one big piece. And then occasionally increasing the duration or intensity of that is another piece.
That makes it a lot more accessible, like just the avoiding inactivity versus trying to go, I need to go 3 days a week and I have to do this. So I appreciate that. And in your book, you talk about decision making being really good for the brain, especially for those with depression. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, decision making is one of those potential downward spirals that like we're stressed, and then in the face of stress, it's sometimes hard to make a decision. So we're like, okay, I'm just not going to make a decision. And then we take a passive role. And then when you take a passive role, your stress can go up and your enjoyment can go down and all, and makes further problems. And a lot of times we're stuck on this idea, particularly for smart, successful people, that we need to make the best decision. But when you're really stressed out, or when there's not enough information to know what the best decision is, trying to make the best decision keeps you stuck, because you're thinking about, well, what are all the consequences if I don't make the best decision? I don't have enough information to know which is the best decision. And by not making a decision, you also leave open all of these possibilities. right? Like if you're just trying to decide where to go for lunch, like, oh, well, what if there's, that place is far away, but what if there's too much traffic? Or like, what, this place, oh, what if it's too crowded? Or what, oh, this place isn't healthy. And like, we're trying to maximize all of these things. And for some things, there actually isn't a best decision. Like, it's a choice about what do you want to value? Well, yeah, that place is healthier and more expensive. Are you choosing? There's not a correct answer of what you should do. And so we're trying so hard to figure out what we should do that we leave all these options open. And with all these options open, that increases our stress and anxiety because everything is floating around. And it's like we're juggling a million balls. As soon as you pick one, it eliminates all of the others. You've started moving down a path. Like you have, 50 doors in front of you. Well, you've opened one door and you started going through it. And that changes the way your brain is perceiving the world. You're not worried about all these other things. You've made a choice. And oftentimes, like we like to think that we choose the things that we like or enjoy. But really, when it comes to psychology and neuroscience, it's often that we like the things that we choose. And so you could have multiple choices that are roughly equivalent and spend all your time trying to figure out what the best is. But the truth is like, well, if you just pick one, then that turns out that you will like that one more. And so I encourage people, don't try and make the best decision, just make a good decision. Like you can basically, often the easiest things to identify are the bad decisions. And often the bad decision is just, we're just sitting there doing nothing on the couch, trying to make a decision. Just make any decision would be better than nothing. And then that is going to change your way the brain perceives the world. It's going to reduce your stress because you reduce your options. You've taken action, which helps you be less passive in your life, which is kind of the problem of depression in the first place. But people who are worried about making, a bad choice or wrong mistake, it's helpful to remember, well, you can make one decision and then realize, oh, now I know what the correct decision is, and then make that decision. But by making a decision, you gain information. And then it's only through that you realize what the correct decision is. And so if you make a decision and it doesn't turn out perfectly, that's not a bad outcome if it helps you realize what the right decision is, because you probably wouldn't have arrived there just sitting, ruminating and thinking about it more.
I appreciate that vantage point because for someone who experiences decision fatigue often, it does make sense that on the other side of it, once you've actually made the decision, there's a sense of accomplishment that comes from that. Even if it wasn't the best decision, you still had the courage to make a decision, which can sometimes feel paralyzing in that moment. So I definitely see the benefit of just making the decision. And now that we've talked a lot about the waking hours of depression, I wanted to ask about sleep. And I know that with depression, you can be on one end of the spectrum where you're getting too much of it. You could be on the other where you're not getting enough of it, or you're not getting like fulfilling sleep. But in your book, you talk about sleep hygiene. And I wondered if you could explain a little bit about how that contributes to the upward spiral and what it does for your brain.
Yeah. I mean, sleep hygiene is a catch-all term that describes the habits and practices that you can do that improve the quality of your sleep and daytime alertness. A lot of times people don't even realize they have a problem with sleep because they're like, oh, I fall asleep fine, but they're not getting quality sleep. And it's hard to realize that because you're not conscious while you're asleep. So the spotlight that's shining on it is the fact that, oh, you just feel really tired all the time, or you don't feel rested and alert when you wake up, or you just really feel like taking a nap all the time. And like those things can help you realize like, oh, maybe my sleep isn't quite as restful as I thought. And there are lots of little things you can do, from mental tricks to just changing your behaviors that improve the quality of your sleep. And the reason why that's so important is that I think a lot of people over focus on the amount of sleep they get, on the quantity of sleep. Like, oh, I need to get 8 hours of sleep. But the truth is that the quality of the sleep that you get is more important than the quantity. It's better to get, say, 6.5 hours of quality sleep than it is to get 8.5 hours of poor quality sleep. And by understanding like what is it that makes quality sleep, you can get more out of the time that you have instead of trying to just add more time. So some simple things have to do with exposure to light. Your brain expects it to be bright during the day and dark at night. So when you wake up in the morning, you want to be in a brightly lit environment or go outside, go for a hot girl walk. Yes, that's getting some movement, but it also exposes your eyes to sunlight, bright lights, which changes your brain's clock. And it lets it know, oh, it's daytime now. And you can reinforce that throughout the day by getting bright light. And then when the sun goes down, sometimes we're inadvertently messing with our brains because we have all the lights in our house, super bright. And that's shifting your clock later. If think about if you ever go camping, like usually it's easier to fall asleep. And it's not just because you were really active during the day. It's because like sun goes down super dark. Like, what are you gonna do? Sit there in the dark for 5 hours? Like, no, like we stay awake later. Oftentimes we have artificial light. So controlling those light effects are important. There's also aspects of we need to, in order to fall asleep and get quality sleep, our brains kind of have to wind down and transition to sleep. So if you're doing stressful things before bedtime, you might be able to fall asleep, but it's going to disrupt the quality of that sleep. And so you should, about an hour before bedtime, though some people's brains are more sensitive or less sensitive, like stop doing work, stop doing stressful things. That includes exciting things, because like that gets your heart pumping and gets your cortisol flowing. So you should try and do calming activities in the hour or so before bedtime. That also includes avoiding exercise. Like exercise is great for you, but just don't do it within 2 to 3 hours of going to bed, because that's going to make it harder to fall asleep. Now, there's another crucial piece where, how do you know like when to start your calming activities if you don't know when your bedtime is? And that's why one of the most important things to take advantage of sleep hygiene is just to have a bedtime. And not just so that you can consciously know, oh, I should start doing calming activities, I'll take a shower, I'll start reading, but because your circadian rhythms, your brain's clock, it will then start to figure out when it should start releasing a chemical called melatonin. It wants to release this chemical about 30 to 45 minutes before you fall asleep, and that helps prepare your brain for sleep. But it can't do that if you don't have a regular bedtime. And in some sense, like it doesn't matter what it is. Like, sure, you could, pick something that you should start with something that you're comfortable with, like, because there are parts of you that you're born that way. Like we have different, what's called chronotypes. Some people are more night owls. Some people go to bed. Like, okay, look at the past 30 years of your life. Like, where do you think you are? Okay, start with there as your best first guess. And then just pick a bedtime. And a lot of times people avoid doing that because they're like, oh, but then it's going to impact my lifestyle, whatever. It's like, you don't have to be rigid and always go to sleep at that time. Just like there should be a time that you think of as your bedtime, and that you mostly go to bed within, half an hour of, then you can occasionally stay up later, but it actually makes it easier to be flexible when you are starting with a structure. I like to think of it like jazz. Like jazz, there's a beat and a rhythm and chord progression. And within that, oh, the musicians can, be creative and go all over the place. Because if you didn't have any structure at all, then it would just be noise. And so, yes, your life might need some flexibility and change, but I can guarantee you that it needs some structure. So, starting with like, okay, what time should I think of as my bedtime, and like aim for that. And then, okay, something came up and I can be flexible or whatever, or just even starting there helps you make sense of the downward spirals that you get into sometimes. Because if you are feeling bad one day and you can look back and be like, oh, that's because I got a terrible night's sleep. Like that doesn't suddenly make you feel better, but it does help you make sense of the situation. Like, oh yeah, I feel kind of tired today, or I feel a little unfocused because I've been sleeping terrible. Okay, well, if once you accept it, then it stops bothering you as much, and then you can make a decision to, okay, well, I'm gonna prioritize my sleep more because it'll help me work better. Or you can be like, I just went to a bachelorette party or whatever. Like, oh, well, yeah, that's why I'm feeling this way. I stayed up partying, but like, I'm glad I made that choice. That was super fun. And like, okay, the consequences are that I feel a little down today, but I'd still make that same choice. But just again, that's where that awareness piece comes in.
I think it's really cool because, I mean, I've noticed how one night of reading 10 pages instead of, a quick scroll before bedtime, like changes. And that's just like one night of sleep. So it's kind of cool that you can literally just change it almost immediately and have a more restful night's sleep. So I like the small habits that have a huge impact. Um, and, uh, and as we start to wrap up, I want to ask about why gratitude is important and how that can change your brain.
Yeah. So gratitude, I feel like that's one of those things that I'm really glad I wrote the Upward Spiral to understand. That's interesting because that's like a form of gratitude for myself for taking those actions. But I feel like it's one of those things that, as a smart, skeptical person who wanted to be scientific, I was like very dismissive of concepts like gratitude, where like, yeah, you just focus on good things. Uh, and it just seemed to like it just didn't seem real. Like, okay, like maybe, yeah, it'll help you feel better sometimes, but like it's just kind of, it's not real, it's not having a real effect. But in looking more at the neuroscience, it's clear that it does cause significant changes in a lot of key brain circuits. Uh, and one important distinction to make, though, is gratitude is about directing your attention or expressing your appreciation through actions or words about things that you appreciate about your life or you're glad are there. It's different than feeling grateful. So a lot of times when you tell people to practice gratitude, what they hear, what they think you mean is like, oh, I need to be more grateful. I need to feel more grateful. And then they don't. They're like, look, I have a great house and a marriage and I don't feel grateful. I'm a ungrateful jerk. No one like, and then the fact that they don't feel grateful, they like beat themselves over the head with it, and that contributes to a downward spiral, unfortunately. And the key is however you feel is, how you feel. But just because things don't like inspire some overwhelming feeling of gratitude doesn't mean that you should ignore them. And in fact, that's kind of the problem in depression sometimes, is that we don't feel grateful. And so then we stop paying attention to things that maybe we can acknowledge that we're grateful for, but since they're not accompanied by the feelings, then we feel ungrateful. So instead, direct your attention to the things that you're glad are there. One of the most powerful ways to do that is just thinking about your past. There's a fantastic study that asked people to just like think of a happy memory. And just the process of thinking of a happy memory increased production of the neurotransmitter serotonin in a key part of the brain's emotional circuitry. And the interesting thing about memories is like they're always there, just like you have a million files on your computer, but you got to click on it, you got to double click on it to like open it up and see. And if it's like some fun, video that you took of your cat or what, like, then then it has the possibility of making you happy. It's just you need to direct your attention there. And even if it doesn't, make you feel as happy as it used to, like, well, what else are you doing with your attention? Are you focusing on all the bad memories? Well, that's contributing to a downward spiral. So at least guiding your attention to the positive parts of your life prevents you from focusing and ruminating on the negative parts of your life. But another key brain change that it has is it changes the dopamine system to sometimes make things more enjoyable, or it can have further changes in your brain to make it easier to make positive choices. And realizing that about gratitude made me understand that, this is actually having effects on my brain, even if I don't feel so grateful at the time. Like, it's still useful for me to write down, a brief reminder of something good, or to put up pictures of my accomplishments or people that I care about, simply to make them more present in my attention, which is going to have compounding effects.
I love the explanation of how it's taking place in your brain, gratitude, because sometimes you hear to implement gratitude into your routine, and it sounds like a little bit there's nothing really supporting what it will do for you. You just hear the phrase a lot, like, practice gratitude, list the things you're grateful for. But to have that context to know kind of what it's doing in your brain, with the chemicals playing a big part, I think gives it a little bit of weight behind it, to make it more impactful for people to practice it. So,
Right, because it can very easily just like the gratitude journal. We all hear, oh, write down 3 things. You're like, oh, okay, I did. But like, sometimes, like, when you just hear I'm supposed to do it without understanding why, then you just kind of do it, and you're undermining yourself in some ways, because you're like, oh, this is dumb. Like, it's not even, I don't even feel grateful. Like, why am I doing it? Like, and to realize, like, no, the purpose is not to change how you feel. Like, sometimes it's wonderful. You can just think of a happy memory, and you all of a sudden feel better. But it's, even if it doesn't make you feel better in the moment or change how you feel in the moment, it's still having a long-term impact in the brain. It's having effects that you're not necessarily aware of. Like, it can improve the quality of your sleep if you do a gratitude journal before sleep. And it's perfectly fine. Like, sometimes when people are doing a gratitude journal, it's like, well, I keep writing the same thing. I can't think of new things. Like, it's okay. Like, you're framing it as, I can't think of new things. Oh, so you still have the same wonderful things in your life that are still there? Like, you can still acknowledge, like, oh, I'm glad I'm married. Oh, I'm glad I had, 3 meals today. Oh, I'm glad my electricity is working. Like, you are glad for those things. Like, if someone said, hey, are you glad you have running water? You'd be like, yes. Like, but because it's such a automatic part of your life, your brain quickly ignores it. And so it's not going to call your attention to it. It's, trying to deal with change and all this other complicated stuff. Like, but if you care about your happiness, then you can draw your attention to the things that you're glad are there, even if they are always there. And in fact, that's a reason to be more grateful for them. But it just means, your brain isn't going to do it for you. You do it. but you can do it yourself.
I was laughing at that because my gratitude journal was literally the same every day. And I was like, am I doing this right? Like, but yes, I am. Um,
There's not a correct way to do it. Like, I mean, you wear a wedding ring to remind yourself of this person that you love and who made a commitment to. And you could be like, oh my, am I still married to this person? Like, isn't there something else? Like, should I get a different? It's like, no, like you you can have things that are in your life that are wonderful. And that's one of the challenges about being happy is your brain is so good at adjusting to whatever circumstances you're in and thinking, okay, that's normal. And then just paying attention to deviations from that, which means that you make $100,000 and you make $500,000. Okay, your brain's going to quickly adjust, and it's helpful to like remind yourself, like, hey, no, like, look, I'm much better off than I was before. Oh, I should be, glad for that. Otherwise, you're often focused on everything that you don't have, on all of the things you haven't yet accomplished, and that can sometimes be good to motivate yourself to want to do more. And that's great too. That's why setting goals is a part of the upward spiral. But it's also uh, important to realize like there are many very successful people who are not happy because they never acknowledge that they are satisfied with what they have and they are appreciative for what they have. And so you should just realize there are different tools for different things. And if you want to accomplish more, sometimes you can realize, oh, what am I dissatisfied with? Although oftentimes, because we never acknowledge the fact that we are satisfied and happy with things, that gets in the way of further success because your brain is like, well, what's the point of making more money? I'm not going to be happy with that either. Or you do get more successful, but you don't get happier. And that's where gratitude can be so powerful, help you be happy, or help you recognize what you actually are unhappy about. So I can be happy about these things and realize like, oh, but this, I have to change this. And therefore I should just take action on that. But getting clear about like what you should take action on and what you should focus on and what you should just enjoy and accept, like being clear on that landscape is the key. And it starts with understanding.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up, especially on gratitude. And now that you've given people a reason to buy into gratitude, giving them the explanation behind it, I think people will see that it is a powerful exercise to implement into their daily life.
Thanks, Alex. I'm grateful for this conversation.
Me as well.
It's impossible to not like make some sort of ironic joke about that when I say every time I talk about it. But it's like, but yeah, like you can be great. Like you can be grateful that I talked about it. I can be grateful that I get to share about this thing that I'm really excited about. And my gratitude benefits me. And this is one of the things by saying thank you to someone else, like, well, it benefits them to feel appreciated, benefits you to express your gratitude. And that's, the upward spiral doesn't just have to be something that you do within yourself. It can be an interpersonal thing.
I love it.
I do too.
Well, thanks, Alex.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you so
Thanks
much
for having me. It was wonderful talking with you. I love talking about this stuff and with people who are interested in it.
Depression can feel like a downward spiral, pulling you into a vortex of sadness, fatigue, and apathy. In the Upward Spiral, neuroscientist Alex Korb demystifies the intricate brain processes that cause depression and offers a practical and effective approach to getting better. Based on the latest research in neuroscience, this book provides dozens of straightforward tips you can do every day to rewire your brain and create an upward spiral toward a happier, healthier life. Whether you suffer from depression or just want a better understanding of the brain, this book offers an engaging and informative look at the neuroscience behind our emotions, thoughts, and actions. The truth is that there isn't one big solution to depression, but there are numerous simple steps you can take to alter brain activity and chemistry. Some are as easy as relaxing certain muscles to reduce anxiety or getting more sunlight to improve your mood. Small steps in the right direction can have profound effects, giving you the power to become your best self as you literally reshape your brain one small change at a time. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order.
New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For nearly 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change.
Join the New Harbinger Clinicians Club, a free membership club exclusively for mental health professionals. Sign up today and you'll receive a special welcome gift, 35% off all professional books, free client resources, free ebooks throughout the year, access to private sales, a subscription to our Quick Tips for Therapists email program, and more. Visit newharbinger.com/clinicians-club for more information.
If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope you might share it with anyone who might benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.